Okay, now we're on part 3 of chapter 9. Long chapter, very important chapter since we're talking about race and ethnicity. So we got through Anglo-conformity. So the other kinds of assimilation are structural assimilation, where I'm able to work with the dominant group, and biological assimilation. This is where I get to marry into the dominant group. And then eventually psychological assimilation, where I start losing the important aspects of the unique part of my identity. So most Americans think of themselves as Americans rather than being Polish, Scottish Americans. Now, the functionalist perspective had a place called ethnic pluralism. This is where, the coexistence of many different kinds of ethnicities could happen. And the only place that this seems to exist is Switzerland. Seems a little goofy to use Switzerland, a landlocked country where the median salary is over $80,000, as your example of being able to have multiple cultures. The idea being that there's German and Dutch and Italian and French and English cultural groups all there, but again, all pretty Caucasian and pretty much all European. The book goes in to talk about segregation. Now, definitely put a little check by segregation. Extremely important concept. This is the spatial separation of groups. And here in America, we measure segregation because your house is going to be the most important thing that you buy. So, if we can find that groups are unable to buy housing in areas that other groups are, then we start seeing the thumbprint again of sort of rampant and difficult racism at work in our cities, and we still do. Lots of segregation still available. Got a little bit better past, let's say, 20 years, but not a lot better. Two different kinds: de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So look at those. So de jure is the law, de facto is something that's done by custom, and we think, oh, well, as long as it's no longer the law, it's not as harsh, but we find, in fact, de jure racism, Jim Crow racism, was harsh, but de facto racism here in America, still extremely harsh. We still find black folks and white folks not living in the same areas, even when they can, by economic circumstances, should be able to live next to one another, but they still don't. Conflict perspectives. A number of perspectives here that I want you to be familiar with. Probably the top 3 would be the caste perspective, that says that no matter what an African American person does, they're always going to be viewed first through the lens of their skin rather than their accomplishments. The class perspective, this was favored by W.B. Dubois, who said, listen, we have to get our money together and be a force economically before white folks will ever give us a fair seat at the table. Then there's something called the split labor market theory, in which it was the labor market in the teens and 20s that allowed businesses to pay black folks half of what white folks earned, and that was illegal, and that it was years and years of that kind of racism that created ghetto housing and those kinds of things that have kept blacks and whites separate because of that racism back in the teens and 20s and 30s, rather than necessarily ardent racism today. Now, we actually go through specific ethnic groups. We start with Native Americans, and obviously we've all been, taught about the Trail of Tears and things like that, but one of the things that we don't ever think about is the quote-unquote success of European